Persephone is getting a rework and it affects her entire kit. Ahoy, my name is SLOTH and today we're talking about the developer update for Persephone, which includes a whole rework for her. We will not go through everything that the developers wrote in detail this time because it is a lot and a lot of it kind of explains itself when you look at the new kit anyways. So we move right to that and talk about the changes and what I think about them. The update. Here we want to go over the planned adjustments for Persephone. With all the above notes, we believe we have clear path for improvement to her existing themes. Here's the plan. Maintain Persephone's gameplay loop of creating a garden and reward her for planning ahead. Give Persephone more control over the actual direction and use cases for her minions. Make sure these use cases feel good to utilize and learn at all skill levels. Give Persephone more immediate impact without her plants, bring her skill floor to a more reasonable level. Give enemies more clear counterplay that can be learned at all skill levels. Decrease frustration when playing against her, specifically her ability to revive and heavily impact an ongoing fight. Her basic attacks remain unchanged. Her passive gets a rework. Persephone now enters the Death Realm upon dying. She can no longer damage, see, or interact with any active entity on the map when in this state. Instead, for free, this part is important, it doesn't cost you any of your seeds anymore. Each time she dies, she can roam the map placing seeds that will spawn when she respawns. This will allow her to respawn with plants immediately available for her use. Persephone still accumulates seeds from her harvest flowers and can still sell them to the fountain. Goals? We wanted to reduce the frustration around Persephone reviving, but still want to give Persephone a way to actively impact that map upon her revival. This will also help Persephone be able to contest things quickly after she revives by having a garden already planted. Now there are a few things with this that are not specified yet that make this interesting. For example, will she have access to the maximum amount of seeds or will she just have the seeds from before death? Also, will this count towards her death timer? So if she gets into this state, is she already counted as dead and her death timer will take down? If the answer is yes, then I think this is mostly beneficial. On the other hand, if the answer is no, that could be quite a problem. If you're, for example, going from mid lane and set up some plants at Fire Giant, but that delays the time until you respawn, and then effectively that means you won't be at Fire Giant at the right time, which would make the passive worth significantly less. Overall, I think it strongly contrasts the previous passive, which in my opinion was the strongest passive in the game, and now it's probably more towards the weaker side of passives, aside of the fact that obviously she gets some free gold from it. But again, it depends on the exact specifics of how this interacts. Her first ability, Bone Rush, gets heavy adjustments. This ability no longer caches aim when fired, allowing Persephone to re-aim it up until the point it starts charging. This ability no longer topples over, damaging enemies in a large AoE. Instead, it charges forward a larger distance, stopping on the first guard hit and slowing them. This ability still places a skull, but will place the skull where it stops. Goals? Reduces the frustration from being poked at an incredible distance, while also making this ability feel better to use as the Persephone player. The long delay and build-up time combined with cached aim made it function very differently from other similar abilities. This change is honestly the most surprising to me. I assumed that Bone Rush would stay untouched, since I thought that ability in itself wasn't all too problematic or anything. And I think it's a bit unfortunate how they are handling this change, because it seems it's essentially just becoming a normal line ability now that can be aimed at any point of the ability, which is basically what almost all line abilities in the game are. I thought the previous option was a bit more unique and took some practice in a good way, though I do like the fact that they kept the skull in it, and actually the skull may or may not be more beneficial now. That's because the skulls themselves also got changed, we get to that in the next ability, but that means it may have some interesting interactions with the one, considering it now always stops exactly on the guard that you hit. Her second ability, Harvest, receives a rework. This ability no longer places skulls on a charge-based cooldown. Again, this makes me wonder how exactly it'll work after death. This ability now does damage in an area after a brief warm-up. Once the area explodes, 3 skulls are placed around that area at once. Goals: provide Persephone with a way to more quickly set up her garden at once while also giving her more immediate impact in a fight. And directly connected to that is the second part of the ability being Harvest Plants, which also received a rework. The Sprout, or the Stage 2 Exploding Plant, has been removed. The skull now immediately transitions to the flower state after 4 seconds. Keep in mind that 4 seconds is what we initially had with this ability. Now, currently, the second stage happens after 2.5 seconds, so this is going to be slowed down again. When Persephone basic attacks or uses Flourish on the flower, it'll charge in the direction it was attacked or the direction that Persephone was facing. It no longer attempts to lock on targets. I'm assuming by saying it will charge in the direction it was attacked is you essentially attack it from the back and it'll run straight in the same direction as the projectile is fired, because otherwise it will be very confusing. The flower will attempt to bite anyone that gets too close at a set interval. Important note, this ability does still have protection from multiple bites happening in rapid succession. Goals: the use cases and the counterplay options for all parties involved should be much clearer. Persephone can try to lead opponents and cut off their escape path with well-aimed flowers, while enemies can clearly see the counterplay, which is don't get too close. What to me is not fully clear with this ability is the set interval mentioned for these biting flowers. If that's just a time interval or after a certain time. So what, for example, would happen if an enemy is close to you, you use Flourish and the flowers start charging? Do they bite immediately, or would they basically walk past the enemy and not bite them at all? Would make a huge difference in terms of overall impact this can have. As for the ability itself, we once again see some simplification here, which is not surprising given that they want to decrease her skill floor. The ability itself will deal damage just by dropping it on the ground after a brief moment. I don't know how long that windup will be. And then the skulls are the secondary element. The question to me is, will the skulls deal a lot of damage, or are they more of an afterthought? How much control do they allow? And that'll make all the difference with this ability. If the charging flowers can have significant impact on your damage output, then I would see this being the new main factor for skill ceiling especially. Ability 3, Flourish, gets balance adjustments. This ability now deals damage on takeoff. Since the sprout has been removed, this ability no longer pre-germinates a skull. This means that this can still turn skulls on the ground into flowers, but afterwards, if you place your 2 again, essentially, you will not get an additional sprout of any kind or additional damage through that. You will just use your normal 2. Goals: give Persephone some extra offense to enemies diving her now that her sprout no longer provides that quick burst of damage upon landing. Now, technically that also simplifies this ability and allows you to punish enemies without having put down flowers, but you will still get more out of this ability by having put down your 2 beforehand, since that'll allow those 3 skulls to turn into flowers. And as far as I understand it, this is the ability that'll allow the flowers to go in the direction that she is facing in. So there's some wiggle room here in how you can control the flowers to follow you when an enemy is engaging on you, which could be very interesting, which you could utilize in different ways. So while this is simplified, I still see a decent amount of skill ceiling here. And ability 4, Grasp of Death, also gets balance adjustments. This ability no longer restricts your movement the closer you move to the center. You're only prevented from moving outside the max radius of this effect. That is actually something that'll affect other interactions with this, because it means her ultimate doesn't set up as well for other guards who can easily confirm their ultimates on them, or for example the Gilgamesh in-place stun will not be possible anymore and will instead stun them on the edge of this ability. Instead, players moving away from the center will have their movement speed reduced. Goals: give players more flexibility with how they fight against Grasp of Death. Before, it was difficult to help a trapped teammate as you heavily restricted your movement. This was on top of making it very difficult to dodge Persephone's incoming attacks. I think that the nerf to the ultimate is understandable because the ult in itself was a very high frustration factor, and it does offer a lot of different things at once. I'm going to read out HiRez final thoughts here quickly and then I'll say my own. In this rework, Persephone players will still need to manage their garden and minions for maximum effect. She has more immediate tools to answer to the ever-shifting battle, but she will still need a skilled player to really unlock her potential. Enemies can also fight her with a better understanding of where the damage is coming from and how to avoid it, while also feeling rewarded for catching a Persephone out during a good play. We are excited for everyone to get that chance to play with Persephone in 8.5. Be sure to hop onto PTS and let us know how she feels. Now, I have to say that I understand the ideas behind the rework. It simplifies her kit primarily, it makes it more readable, you have better responses to it, it gives HiRez a better way to balance her in many ways. And I think that Persephone was a very complex character beforehand, and that was part of the reason that drove people away from her. But at the same time, I think a lot of Persephone players will be very frustrated with this. A simple kit is easier to pick up, yeah, but it doesn't offer the same level of intricacy, and it doesn't feel as rewarding to learn it in many situations if the skill ceiling isn't as high anymore, because the overall kit has been simplified in many ways. It's kind of like taking a Willis kit, nerfing her damage slightly, making her 2 an instant AoE that doesn't require basic attacks, and her 3 a guaranteed knock-up from any direction. Sure, it makes the character easier to learn and probably easier to balance as well, but does that necessarily make for an interesting character at that point? With Persephone, I think the verdict is still out here because we haven't seen everything. It especially depends a lot on the 2 in my opinion, and especially the aspect with the growing plants, the flowers that chase after enemies, because they no longer chase after enemies, they just go in their straight line, and depending on how well you can control that and how much impact that can have, that would have a significant impact on her overall kit, because this is still tied into her 2 as well as into her 3, and according to what we know so far, it might also be tied into her new passive. So I don't want to be too quick to fully judge the complexity here, and maybe I'll just open up the doors for players to pick her up and then figure out more interesting ways to play her. What I'm not quite sure about is why literally all abilities had to be tackled and pretty much all of them had to be simplified to some degree. I feel like the 2, yeah, the ult probably, and then maybe the passive would have been good points to tackle, but they just went over the whole kit and were like, okay, we're redoing this entirely, which leaves a lot of question marks basically, and we'll just have to see how it goes. I'm not fully sold on this rework yet, and I'll have to test it in-game before I make further judgment about it, but I'm curious to see what will happen here and how Persephone players especially will see that in the long run as well. There may be a second video with some upcoming things from the patch later today if I can finish it in time, so if you want to see that, click like and subscribe, or I will go to my garage, hide in the corner, stare at Thanks to my patrons for making this video possible. That includes That Nick Walker, Donald Dryden, Melancholy Gengar, Dwayne Brennan, Lanta25 Green, Zed the Undead, Nevitz Jr., Rawas, and everyone else you see here.